All right, 1 Kings 22 is the last chapter on a sad story and the story of Israel's history. Ahab, worst king, his time finally comes to an end, as we're not surprised, we're expecting it. But what we see in 1 Kings 22 is the narrative, the story of what is described in Psalm 75. Okay, and so Psalm 75 tells us, and we'll read the 10 verses and a very little comment, and then we'll go to 1 Kings 22. So Psalm 75 is 10 verses. It says, "We give thanks to you, O God, we give thanks, for your name is near. We recount your wondrous deeds. At the set time that I appoint, I will judge with equity." This is God talking. "When the earth totters and all its inhabitants, it is I who keep steady its pillars." That's important. God controls everything on the earth and all its inhabitants. Verse 4, "I say to the boastful, do not boast, and to the wicked, do not lift up your horn." Your horn was, which we'll see a horn mentioned in 1 Kings 22, that the horn was your representation of power. And if you remember Revelation, there were leaders that had horns, and their horns represented power. Horn was broken off, they lost some power. So a horn represents your power. He says, "Don't lift up your horn, do not lift up your horn on high, or speak with a haughty neck." Verse 6, "For not from the east or from the west, not from the wilderness comes lifting up, but it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another. For in the hand of the Lord, Yahweh, there is a cup with foaming wine, well mixed, and he pours out from it. And all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs." This is the cup of God's wrath. And the people who are wicked have to drink it, and it's God's judgment on them. Verse 9, "But I will declare it forever." What is he declaring? That God is in complete control. And when there is wickedness on the earth, God like pours out the cup of his wrath, and the wicked have to drink it, God's judgment. "And I will sing praises to God, of the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked I will cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be lifted up." So wickedness and righteousness side by side, that's what we see in 1 Kings 22. Now let's go to 1 Kings 22. And what we see is Yahweh is in complete control, as we expect him to be, as was sung in Psalm 75. I don't know about you, but in this election year, I get tired of election years. And the more of these every 4 years, it's like, oh, an election year. It was like that in 2020, and COVID didn't help that. And 2024, I'm like, how's it going to get worse than 2020? Well, we're in 2024. In 2028, if God tarries, we will likely have to live through that election year. And then I'm talking about national presidential election years. But I was tired of the election year by January of 2024. And some we're glad that we're in a country where we have fair elections. If we were in like Venezuela, where we have heard and assumed that the election happened and the person who didn't get the votes still took power, because that's how corrupt governments work. People ultimately don't decide, though, who governs a country. God does. We know that from Psalm 75. Psalm 75 says that God is in complete control over world leaders. He lifts some up and he puts down others. Those who are wicked, he judges. Nothing happens in elections or kingdoms where they pass the lineage down, the rulership down from one father to a son or to a brother. Nothing happens in kingdoms or elections outside of God's sovereignty. And he judges those kings and kingdoms who reject him. That's kind of what you got at the end of Psalm 75, where God judges those who reject him. So within a kingdom, there are godly people, a remnant that we'll see even this coming Sunday in the book of Amos. There's a godly remnant that is speaking truth to an ungodly king, ungodly kingdom, and encouraging them to submit to God. Stop the ungodliness. Live righteous before God. Look at God's commands. Look at what God's word says, and let's get back in line with what God says. So Elijah's played that role of speaking godliness and truth into that ungodly kingdom of Israel. And now there's another prophet that shows up on the scene in the final days of Ahab. That his name is mentioned probably more than Ahab's name. Ahab is not mentioned by name very often. It's just the king. The king. Like we know he's there. His name isn't important, but Micaiah, the the prophet's name is mentioned often. So let's look now at 1 Kings 22. We're not going to be able to read all of it. And in fact, I'm not going to go past verse 40 because 41 to 53 is recorded elsewhere in scripture in more detail. So it's kind of like First Kings ends with just a summary of some other kings. There's godly kings, ungodly kings, and just a very few details. So I'm not going to deal with that because we have so much text in verses 1 to 40. Also, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in 1 to 12 or 29 to 40. I'm going to spend most of our time in the middle, which is what God reveals, some unique things of how he operates. And we're expecting to see Yahweh's in complete control. So we know, and you have heard in Sunday school, that Jehoshaphat, I think it was last Sunday, uh, allied himself with several ungodly kings in marriage of his son to Athaliah. Bad decision by Jehoshaphat. And his son would say, this is not a good thing for me to be married to Athaliah. She seems to be as wicked as Jezebel was. And then he's in battle a couple times going with the nation of Israel to fight battle. But the focus in Kings is not on the godly king, Jehoshaphat, although he is mentioned by name several times. It's not evaluating this alliance. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is God is again giving an ungodly king a way to see him again and again and again and again. And this is the final attempt of God to get Ahab's attention, and using a godly king and using a godly prophet to get his attention. And he still doesn't get Ahab's attention. Okay. So God is pouring out wrath now on Ahab, and it's going to come by his death at the end of the end of the chapter. So for 3 years, verse 1, Syria and Israel continued without war. So in times of peace is the time to build your army. Whenever you're constantly fighting, you can't build your army. But in times of peace, likely Ahab's army, remember, was really small, 7,000. And they fought a couple battles, and they won because God helped them over that huge army. But Ahab grows his army probably a little bit in these 3 years. But when we get to Jehoshaphat's story, Jehoshaphat has an army of over 1.2 million people.
Wow.
He has a massive army, 10 times bigger than the army that Ahab fought against, 127,000. So Jehoshaphat, God is with him. And if you were Ahab, you'd want to ally with someone who God is with, because he's got wealth and he's got this massive army. And Ahab's got this little tiny army, and his kingdom is crumbling. He almost lost the kingdom when they were surrounding Samaria. And so it's to Ahab's advantage that he has Jehoshaphat on his side. And he could convince Jehoshaphat, we're all God's people. Yeah. And they took our city, Ramoth Gilead, which is where I think King Saul is from. There's a couple stories about Ramoth Gilead, Ramoth Gilead in history, likely where King Saul is from, and other neat stories. We're not going to get into those, but this is a cause for Jehoshaphat is visiting with Ahab. It's at this visitation that he asks for help. And verse 4, Jehoshaphat says, when Ahab asks for help, I am as you are, and my people is your people, my horses is your horses. And Ahab gets a really good deal with this alliance. But yet, in this unwise alliance, there is some wisdom that Jehoshaphat is showing that's different than Ahab. Okay, so let's look at the wisdom that Jehoshaphat is showing in verse 5. Jehoshaphat says to the king of Israel, though, before we go out to battle, inquire first for the word of the Lord. This is how godly leaders are distinct from ungodly leaders, is they want to know a word from Yahweh. What does Yahweh, the ruler of heaven and earth, what does he think about this battle? Okay. Ahab uh, isn't concerned about what Yahweh thinks. He may have Jezebel doing her magic and all kinds of witchcraft with the prophets of Baal to determine, oh yeah, this is fine, and whatever weird demonic things that she has going. But Jehoshaphat's not concerned about that. He's concerned about one thing. What does Yahweh say about us going to battle? The godly kings and the godly leaders, like when Joshua was serving as leader, whenever they checked with Yahweh, God told David, Joshua, others, yes, fight, no, or yes, wait, but do it this way. Jehoshaphat wants to know what Yahweh says. So verses 5 to 8, the first part of verse 8 is this, and Jehoshaphat is concerned that we have Yahweh on our side. Verse 6, then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together who supposedly represent the Lord, about 400 men, and this is smaller than the 850 that he had before, and says to them, shall I go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain? And they said, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. But Jehoshaphat is not content with this, and he says, is there not here another prophet of Yahweh, of whom he may inquire? He looks at these 400 guys, and I don't know how he discerns this, other than maybe their dress, maybe how they behave themselves, or what he knows to be true, that these 400 are fed by Ahab and Jezebel, and so they can't be godly prophets. Whatever it is, he discerns within a couple minutes, these guys are not speaking for Yahweh. All 400 of them. They're not legitimate God's prophets. Deuteronomy has something to say about false prophets. They shouldn't have any place in Israel, but in an ungodly kingdom, they are fed well. They are deceiving many, and Jehoshaphat's not taking their word. Okay, so when we get to verse 8, he is concerned that these guys are not speaking for Yahweh. Verse 8, and the king of Israel, he's not called Ahab, the king of Israel says to Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom may we inquire of Yahweh, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, but I hate him. When you read that the first time, you're like, that is hilarious. That here's a ungodly king who has a godly prophet, and his short analysis of, I hate this guy. Why do you hate this guy? Okay, and he tells us why he hates him. In verse 8 continues, because he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil. All right. Now, if you are an ungodly man, a king, and you have a godly prophet, and every time you talk to him, he prophesies evil, that should tell you something. God's prophets speak for God, right, and they speak God's truth. They speak God's words. They remind kings of their responsibility to obey God, that there is a ultimate king, that you are not independent of that king, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So God's leader wants to know if Yahweh is for this battle, and he discerns with these 400 that we don't know if Yahweh is for us. So God's leader discerns who is speaking for Yahweh and who is not. And you can see Jehoshaphat is different than Ahab in this conversation. Verse 9. At the end of verse 8, Jehoshaphat analyzes what the king says and says, let not the king say so. He is rebuking Ahab. Verse 9, then the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, hey, bring quickly Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And it's probably not, oh yeah, bring him. It's probably, oh, we got to bring him. Verse 10, Now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, were sitting on their thrones, arrayed in their robes at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria. This is where Ahab is king. And all the prophets were prophesying before them. So they didn't stop. They just kept going, and they're getting creative to try to convince their king and Jehoshaphat that yes, you should go out into battle. And to the point that this guy Zedekiah, who's going to come up later, the son of Chenana, I assume how you say his name, made for himself horns of iron. Horns, remember how we said in Psalm 75. He made for himself horns of iron and said, "Thus says Yahweh, with these you shall push the Syrians until they are destroyed." He's just totally making this up. And all the prophets prophesied so. They all watched him. They maybe had some other things, but they're trying. This looks, if you were to compare this with the prophets of Baal back in chapter 17, 18, they look similar. Okay. False prophets not speaking for Yahweh. And all the prophets prophesied, so go up to Ramoth Gilead and triumph. This is what all of them are saying, 400. And Yahweh will give it into the hand of the king. And Jehoshaphat doesn't believe these guys. Good for him. God's leader discerns who is speaking for Yahweh and who is not. So then in verses 13 to 28, God reveals some spiritual realities here. What's going on behind the scenes through his true servants. So you got 400 false prophets. You got one true prophet, one true godly king. And so when the messengers get to verse 13 and summon Micaiah, and said to him, "Hey, behold, the words of the prophets with one accord." Everybody's saying the same thing, which was in verse 12. "Let your word be the word like them and speak favorably." So say the same thing. This is kind of like they tried to hire Balaam, a prophet for hire, and he tried to get money from Balak, the king of Moab, back in, was it Joshua's day? And so they're trying to get Micaiah to say what the other 400 says. But look at what verse 14. Here is, it was a godly king, now here's a godly prophet. How does the godly prophet respond in verse 14? He says, "As Yahweh lives," we serve the living God here. "What Yahweh says to me, that I will speak." That's kind of what Balaam said too. I can only say what God puts in my mouth. That's what Micaiah says. And when he had come to the king said to him, "Micaiah, shall we go to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain?" And there's not a good relationship here between Micaiah and Ahab. We know that. We know Ahab's feelings toward this guy. So he's just kind of going through the motions, Ahab is, in asking this guy. And he knows what this guy says, I'm not going to like it. And he answered, "Yeah, go up and triumph, and Yahweh will give it into your hand of the king." And he probably says it in a way that is probably, you could probably read sarcasm. Okay. You're reading sarcasm here because how the king responds. And let's see how Ahab responds to that. But the king said to him, "How many times shall I swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of Yahweh?" He got from his reaction, from Ahab's reaction, that Micaiah was likely being sarcastic in verse 15. "This is what your prophet said. This is what you told me I should say. Okay, I'll tell you what you want to hear." But that's that's not the truth. And the king knows it. And then he gets verse 17. So God's servants, now the prophet, must refuse to misrepresent him. There is a New York Times best-selling book called Shepherds for Hire. And it is a book that is, and a lot of research by a Christian, that there are many pastors in our country that are getting paid to speak for wickedness and promote wickedness and don't speak out against sin. And we'll just say that we can't go along with that. When if we get if we find out that they're trying to influence us or other godly pastors around us or other godly Christians around us, and you can get advanced, you can get money, if you don't speak out against the wickedness of our country, we're not going to be able to go along with it. And Micaiah shows us here that he refuses to misrepresent God. And so we do have to as well. Even if it's unpopular, even if we're 400 to 1 odds against us, it doesn't really matter. Micaiah was very clear. I am only going to say what God tells me to say. So he tells them in verse 17, he reveals what God says he can reveal, what God shows Micaiah. And what he shows Micaiah, this godly prophet, is fascinating. So he gives a summary and then he goes into detail later. So verse 17 is a summary. He said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains. Anytime an army is scattered, that's not a good thing. As sheep that have no shepherd, also not a good thing. And Yahweh said, and he analyzes what he's seeing and says, these have no master. Let each return to his home in peace. All right, so the army is going to be scattered. And why are they scattered? Because their master is no longer. And the solution at the end of the battle, let everybody just go back in peace, kind of like a retreat. It doesn't like the army gets defeated. It's like the army doesn't get defeated, but they're scattered, they're not unified, and their shepherd dies. And verse 18. So that was the summary of what God showed him. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, when he realized he wasn't making this up, he wasn't speaking sarcastically, this is actually what God showed Micaiah. The king of Israel, again, not using his name Ahab, but says to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? And now Micaiah continues and gives more details of how this came about. Micaiah said, therefore, hear the word of Yahweh. I'm going to substitute Yahweh for Lord. I underline in my Bible, all caps Lord. So here is God's covenant name, and he's going to use it over and over again. Hear the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne. Whoa. Okay, and he's telling us what God showed him. And all the hosts of heaven standing beside him on the right hand and on the left. Let's assume that this is the host of the armies of heaven. These are angelic hosts. And there's a massive number of angels here. And continuing, I lost my place here. Verse 20. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? God is talking to the angels and says, who's going to tell Ahab to go up and so that he will be killed at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing and another said another. Then a spirit came. It may be an evil spirit, like a demon, came forward and stood before Yahweh and said, I will entice him. Demons always want to deceive and they want to destroy. We don't see godly angels deceiving or just maybe destroying, like the death angel, but we don't see godly angels. We see godly angels telling truth constantly, doing God's work and serving God's people from Hebrews 1. But when we see demons at play in the Gospels, for instance, they're always deceiving, getting people destroyed or scared. And so it's likely that the godly angels don't want to go deceive, but an ungodly angel, a demon, has no trouble. This is his bread and butter, so to speak. So this ungodly angel says, and we're not sure of that. I just assume that. And the ungodly angel says, I will entice him. And Yahweh and this ungodly angel have this conversation. Verse 22. And Yahweh says to him, by what means? How are you going to do it? And he said, I will go out. I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, okay. God responds to the ungodly angel and says, you shall entice him and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, so that's the end of what God shows Micaiah from the throne of heaven and this interaction between God and angels. And then the analysis of the summary, verse 23. Now, therefore, behold, Yahweh has put a lying spirit in the mouth, or he allowed a lying spirit to go in the mouth of all of your prophets, all of these your prophets, Ahab and Yahweh has declared disaster for you. Now, he already declared disaster for Ahab several times, but most recently in chapter 21 through Elijah. Now, second prophet, he's declaring disaster, and now Ahab has a choice. Am I going to listen to the one godly prophet or my 400 false prophets? And he chooses the 400 false prophets. You're like, it's your last time to see God and respond in humility. No, he doesn't. So, verse 24. Then you can expect the lying prophets to not like what Micaiah says any more than Ahab likes it. And so the leader, the guy who made the horns and was making a spectacle of himself, verse 24, then Zedekiah, the son of Chenaiah, came near and struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, how did the Spirit of Yahweh go from me to speak to you? Like he's like, God told me to do to slap you in the face. And Micaiah said, behold, you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber and hide yourself. You're going to be scared to death yourself, Zedekiah. And then the king of Israel responds this way in verse 26. Seize Micaiah and take him back to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son. So Ahab's son, Joash, is going to rule after Ahab dies. And they put Micaiah in prison. Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him meager rations of bread and water until I come in peace. So now we know what Ahab's thinking. Micaiah didn't tell me the truth. My 400 prophets did tell me the truth. And what does Micaiah say? He gets the last word. Micaiah says, if you return in peace, Yahweh has not spoken by me. And he said, hear all you peoples. Like, okay, you all heard. Ahab put me in prison thinking when he comes back in peace, I get out of prison. But he's not coming back in peace because Yahweh says he's not coming back. So God's servants must realize that the ungodly will not like them. Whenever we tell people the truth, we tell people what God says, we don't expect the ungodly to love what God says. Expect them to hate you and expect them to hate what God says. That's the reality but God clearly shows Micaiah exactly how the angels are interacting in order for Ahab to eventually fall. And he believes the lies when he could have believed the truth. So the rest of the story, verses 29 to 40, you probably know this. I'll just point out a few things. So the king of Israel, it still doesn't call him Ahab. And Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. And the king of Israel says, Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself. So he probably has in the back of his mind, maybe I can fool God. God says I'm going to die. And this really is a battle between the king of Israel and all of the Syrians. And the Syrians know we just have to kill the king of Israel. And it's interesting, I think, that the same king, Ben-Hadad, is the one that made this alliance with Ahab. And they probably broke that alliance, which is why Ahab wants this city back. But back whenever the Ramoth, or back when Ben-Hadad was spared by Ahab twice, and God says, you shouldn't have spared this guy. You shouldn't have spared this guy. He spares him. That's going to be his downfall. Mm-hmm. Also, the details of this story. Jehoshaphat dresses up, we know the story, in his robes, and Ahab goes in as an ordinary soldier, but still in a chariot. And verse 33, when the captains of the chariot saw that it was not, they're trying to just kill the king. They don't really care about fighting the rest, and they think Jehoshaphat's the king, and they realize that's not Ahab. He maybe is taller, he's different, he doesn't wear that robe, whatever. They realized it wasn't the king of Israel. They turned back from pursuing him. But a certain man, we have no idea who this guy is, draws his bow at random Like, he's an archer, and he's like, I wonder if my arrow will go as far as those chariots. By himself, not together, just random. This is God controlling everything. It's just so fascinating. Here's the king of Israel trying to hide from God, trying to hide from God's judgment. And a certain man draws his bow from random and strikes the king between the scale armor and the breastplate. Okay. There's the breastplate, the scale armor, and it's like a small, small gap. Or maybe when his arm is out, there's just a little gap, and that's where the arrow goes. You're like far away. Like God is in complete control of this. It's like better than David and Goliath, where David can hit this little part of Goliath that's not covered. When God is with you, you succeed. When God is against you, you have no chance of succeeding. And God wanted Ahab to repent. He reached out to him multiple times to show him his glory, and he would not repent, would not turn from his idolatry, would not turn to God and listen to God's warnings. So the battle continued, and Ahab says, hey, turn around and carry me, verse 34, out of the battle, for I'm wounded. And the blood flows into the bottom of his chariot, and the army just disperses when the king dies. Verse 37. So the king dies, and they brought him to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria, and they washed the chariot by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood. The prostitutes washed themselves in it, according to the word of Yahweh that he had spoken. Now, the rest of the acts of Ahab's, all he did, he built an ivory house, but we didn't hear about that ivory house until just now. And all that he built, so he was a builder, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah his son reigned in his place. God controls, God fulfills his word. God controls the randomness to bring judgment on the ungodly, and God controls the death of the ungodly to fulfill his word. He fulfills Psalm 75, that the wicked are going to drink of the wrath of God and be judged. God promised this would happen in chapter 21 through Elijah. The very same place where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, who was a righteous man, that's the same place the dogs are going to lick up your blood. And one chapter later, that's exactly what happened. God promised that he would judge Ahab, and his blood would be drank in the same place as Naboth in chapter 21. Psalm 1 reminds us, as we saw some of Psalm 1 Sunday, at the end of Psalm 1, the ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff that the wind drives away. The ungodly come, and they're wicked, flash in the pan, all that the might and everything that they could do, then build. And the ivory palace, that's great, but Ahab's not enjoying that ivory palace. He went out to battle, and he dies. Though the wicked are like chaff that the wind drives away. God allows you to resist him for a time, but never allows you to avoid his consequence for that resistance.